All right. Welcome, everyone, to the first full session of our Intuiting Life conversational seminar series. Some of you may have been present a couple of weeks ago at the Tuesday morning Cobb and Friends session where Spyridon and myself began to introduce this new book, Process Philosophical Perspectives on Biology, subtitled Intuiting Life. We're using the subtitle as the title of our seminar series. Today is the first Saturday session, and we will have two speakers today. Unfortunately, Arthur Arejo could not join us. He is co-editor of this volume with Spyridon. Something came up at the last minute, but Spyridon has stepped up to fill that slot, and hopefully Arthur will be able to join us in a later session that we will reschedule. We'll keep you posted. So today we will have Spyridon Kotrifinis, who will speak first for about 30 minutes to share with us a different part of his introduction, editor's introduction to this book. And he's going to focus this time on some of Whitehead's intuitions and contributions to philosophy and to biophilosophy. Let me tell you a bit about Spyridon for those who are not present at the Cobb and Friends session a few weeks ago. So Spyridon Kotrifinis is associate professor for philosophy at the Technical University of Berlin. Between 2012 and 2014, he was visiting associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He has specialized in process philosophy, including Whitehead and Bergson, biophilosophy, including von Uexküll and others, classical metaphysics, including Aristotle and Leibniz, and complexity theory. His research focuses on the establishment of a new theory of the biological organism that is based on process ontology. And he is the author and editor of 6 books, one of which is this one, and numerous articles and book chapters. Our second speaker today is Federico Giorgi, and I will introduce him when Spyridon has concluded his section. So Spyridon, please do introduce us to the contributions of Whitehead to this study of biophilosophy.
Hello. So, hello everybody. Okay. So, I will begin with a brief historical review of the understanding of intuition in Western philosophy. And in the second part of my talk, I will consider some of the key philosophical intuitions in Whitehead's work, with particular emphasis on his biophilosophical intuitions. So the first session is about the distinction between intuitive and discursive analytic cognition and knowledge in Occidental philosophy. In the history of Occidental philosophy since antiquity, there has been a sharp distinction between intuitive and discursive analytical knowledge, leading to the belief that there are two essentially different forms of knowledge. So the first point is on the discursive analytic cognition and knowledge. The discursive analytical type of knowledge progresses through the use of general concepts or universals, which are abstract entities. In contemporary scientific disciplines, most symbols or general concepts represent entities, properties, operations, and relationships that are neither sensually experienceable nor imaginable. While, for example, the multiplication 2 times 2 is easy to imagine, an operation of the type 27 divided by 6 and the whole in the power of 9 lacks any vividness and can only be carried out according to abstract rules. Mental operations, the rules of which are determined by a particular discourse, produced from the combination of such abstract symbols, more complex abstract symbols or general concepts that represent other, mostly unimaginable entities such as enormous numbers, high-dimensional mathematical spaces, and astronomical objects that are not directly observable. The ability of discursive analytic reason to operate symbolically has often led to the judgment that it is superior to the intuitive approach to reality. This position was explicitly advocated by, among others, the influential 18th century German Jewish philosopher Salomon Maimon, and the founding father of logical positivism and the Vienna Circle, Moritz Schlick. However, it would be a great mistake if the Occidental epistemology were to be limited to the discursive analytical forms of cognition and knowledge. So the second point is on intuitive cognition and knowledge. The intuitive form of cognition and knowledge has been the subject of Occidental philosophy since antiquity. In everyday language, the term intuition, derived from the Latin verb intuere, which means to consider, describes the ability to gain insights into a wide variety of facts without the discursive use of reason. That is, without conscious conclusions mediated by concepts. Against the background of process philosophy, it makes sense to focus on four main points of understanding of intuition in the Occidental philosophy. The first point: throughout the history of Western philosophy, intuition has been credited with the ability to grasp its object suddenly, instantaneously, and directly. The immediacy of intuitive knowledge claimed by Themistius and Philoponus in late antiquity, Thomas of Aquin, Locke, Leibniz, Schelling, and Edward von Hartmann, and other thinkers. So this position is opposed to discursive knowledge, which arises, according to this position, intuitive knowledge is opposed to discursive knowledge, which arises slowly and step by step. The second point: according to some eminent philosophers, intuitive cognition can only be mediated through the senses. Intuition is then reduced to an exclusively sensually mediated activity, which recognizes the nature of objects, their features, and some of their relationships between them. For example, equality, likeness, or inequality, only if it is dealing with physically existing things presented to the senses. This idea was advocated by Duns Scotus, Salomon Maimon, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Immanuel Kant. From this perspective, the intuitive act appears as an automatic, spontaneous, immediate, and effortless cognitive process that produces pure evidence. The third point: this understanding of intuition, what I said in the second point, contrasts with that of thinkers who acknowledge the existence of another form of intuition that does not require the presence of physical objects, as it can be conveyed through thinking, imagination, and experiencing one's own consciousness. René Descartes, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Edmund Husserl, and Benedetto Croce explicitly advocated this idea. The fourth and last point: some of the most influential thinkers of the history of Western philosophy share the belief that the contents provided by intuition are the simplest and most indisputable element from which knowledge can emerge. So this position was supported by Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Leibniz, Hume, and Maimon. Starting from this position, many philosophers since late antiquity have come to the conclusion that intuition is an infallible mental faculty, a judgment that has not gone unchallenged. The infallibility of intuition is represented, for example, by Themistius, Philoponus, Aquinas, Descartes, Spinoza, and Locke, and the Polish phenomenologist and Husserl disciple Roman Ingarden. In the second session, I'm going to present philosophical some philosophical and biophilosophical intuitions of the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead did not explicitly formulate a theory of intuition, as, for example, Bergson did. Nevertheless, the core ideas of his process metaphysics are deeply rooted in certain philosophical intuitions which he expresses in his works on several occasions. I distinguish the following central philosophical intuitions on which Whitehead's metaphysics relies. So the following list is not complete. In the introduction of the book, I have mentioned some more philosophical intuitions of Whitehead, but because we don't have enough time, I had to reduce the list. So the first philosophical intuition of Whitehead is that the ontological is about the ontological fundamentality of experience. One of the central pillars of Whitehead's metaphysics is the conviction that the merely material and the merely mental are pure abstractions that have found their way to philosophy and science. Following this insight, he bases his metaphysics on the philosophical intuition that the most fundamental beings of the universe, which he calls actual entities or actual occasions, are dipolar beings with physical and mental aspects. Because of their mental side, actual entities are subjects, more precisely acts of experience. Since experience as we know it contains subjective qualities such as colors, smells, and tastes, we can assume that subjective qualities of whatever kind are inherent in the experience of all actual entities. The second intuition, processuality as determination of essence. The actual entities are not conceived of as substances having a fixed essence, but as processes in the strongest sense that word has in process metaphysics. Entities that determine their own essence. This is actually my own understanding of what is an actual entity that determines its own essence. So actual entities are self-creating and self-forming subjects that arise for their own sake and strive for its experiences. The third philosophical intuition, internal relationality or mutual immanence. Since the subject is not conceived as a windowless monadic substance of the Leibnizian kind, the source of its experiences can only be its relationships to reality consisting of other actual entities. Its actual entity thus consists in the merging of the experiences that it has with other actual entities into a specific unit of experience. Since an actual entity only comes into being through experiential relationships, or in Whitehead's own terminology, prehensions, to other actual entities, it cannot exist without those relationships. In philosophy, relationships without which the relata cannot exist are called internal relationships. The internal relationality of actual entities can also be expressed as, I quote Whitehead, the immanence of occasions of experience, end of quote. The fourth Whiteheadian philosophical intuition is about causality. Causality is real and not a creation of the human mind. Whitehead doubts that all perceptions are conveyed to us through the sense organs, and sees the widespread assumption as an error, and sees this widespread assumption that that all perceptions are conveyed to us through the sense organs as an error that has impeded the progress of metaphysics. The clearest example of non-sensual perception in human experience is, I quote Whitehead, our knowledge of our own immediate past, end of quote, that lies, I quote again, between a tenth of a second and half a second ago, end of quote. There is an interpenetration between successive experiential processes of this kind, whereby the subjective form in which something was experienced, for example, pleasure or anger, is maintained throughout the succession of these processes. Immediate knowledge of the continuity of our own psychological processuality is conveyed to us through an inner sense that is through a form of intuition that is not sensual. It is a form of intuition that is mediated by the human body. Whitehead sees in this continuity the clearest, most immediate evidence we can have of the causal transference of a subjective form from the past to the present. From this, he extrapolates the justification for assuming similar causal connections between past and present in nature, since within the framework of his metaphysics, nature also consists of fundamental acts of experience. I quote, "This continuity of subjective form is the primary ground for the continuity of nature. Thus, non-sensuous perception is an aspect of the continuity of nature." I have taken this quote from Adventures of Ideas. Whitehead sees our ability to directly sense the causal continuity between the experiences of our own bodies as the key to understanding the causal continuity of nature in general. This is a core idea of his metaphysics, starting from which he argues against Hume's critique of the notion of causality, which is one of the foundations of Kant's critical philosophy. Whitehead's critique of Hume, thus, has very far-reaching consequences for his process metaphysics, for it provides the most important basis of his decisive rejection of Kant's critical philosophy. Now, the fifth point is about Whitehead's main biophilosophical intuitions. So, biophilosophical intuitions. Central questions of biology form an important starting point of Whitehead's mature process philosophical period, which begins with Science and the Modern World. They are presented here only in summary form. So the first biophilosophical intuition, Whitehead, is about the ontological fundamentality of life in all of nature. He considers the problem of life to be the central question of science and philosophy. So it's not only the central question of biology, but of all science and philosophy. He insists that the basic principles of life are exemplified in rudimentary form in all forms of physical existence. Living nature can give us the key to understanding non-biological nature. I quote, "The doctrine that I am maintaining is that neither physical nature nor life can be understood unless we fuse them together as essential factors in the composition of really real things whose interconnections and individual characters constitute the universe," end of quote, taken from Modes of Thought. He demands that the shortcomings of our concept of physical nature be compensated by a fusion with the concept of life. He thus often applies the term life to processes of both biotic nature, which is studied by the life sciences, and abiotic nature, which is primarily the subject of physics. He regards the term life meaning bare activity. It's a quote, bare activity, and value existing for its own sake. Biological beings differ from the inorganic in that they realize this meaning to a much higher degree than the latter. So the second biophilosophical intuition, Whitehead's, life is characterized primarily by the teleological introduction of novelty. The specific difference between abiotic enduring beings and living beings is that in the latter, novelty is constantly emerging and unfolding its effect on the whole living body. The vitality of living beings rests on their ability to continually reorient their teleological activity to suit the ever-changing circumstances with which they're continually confronted. I mean, circumstances within the environment of an organism, but also within the body of the organism. I quote, "The essence of life is the teleological introduction of novelty with some confirmation of objectives," taken from Adventures of Ideas. Another quote, "The essence of life is to be found in the frustrations of established order. The universe refuses the deadening influence of complete conformity," taken from Modes of Thought. Neither the behavior of an organism in its environment nor the state changes of its biomolecular dynamics can be explained by the continuation of what has been inherited from the past. Whitehead's view of aliveness is summed up in the following passage. I quote, "An organism is alive when in some measure its reactions are inexplicable by any tradition of pure physical inheritance. Life is the name of originality and not for tradition. The characteristic of life is a reaction adapted to the capture of intensity under a large variety of circumstances," end of quote. Although the introduction of novelty is a core feature of life, life does not aim at novelty for its own sake. New teleological goals are introduced due to the pursuit and actualization of new values in the life of organisms. The third main biophilosophical intuition, Whitehead's main work contains some fascinating statements about the intrinsic connection between life and the empty space. But to the same extent, they seem puzzling. I quote from Process and Reality. "Life is a characteristic of empty space and not of space occupied by any corpuscular society. Life lurks in the interstices of its living cell and in the interstices of the brain." End of quote. Whitehead refuses to connect what is the root of a living being's vitality with the fullness of space through physical materiality. I quote again, "not of space occupied by any corpuscular society," end of quote. In the fullness of space, Whitehead sees evidence of the dominance of the repetitive because non-creative processuality of inorganic physicality. What is actually alive in living beings lurks in the space between the spaces that are occupied by the dictates of repetition. The special biological importance that Whitehead attaches to the empty spaces within the cell and the brain can be better understood by considering the following explanations. I quote, "So far as the functioning of the animal body is concerned, The total result is that the transmission of physical influence through the empty space within it has not been entirely in conformity with the physical laws holding for inorganic societies. The molecules within an animal body exhibit certain peculiarities of behavior not to be detected outside an animal body. In the physical field of empty space produced by the originality of living occasions, chemical dissociations and associations take place which would not otherwise occur, end of quote. Whitehead thus sees in the emptiness of space within the body an indispensable conditions for the development of a chemical reactivity that cannot take place in lifeless beings. In my own process metaphysical biophilosophy, I have introduced the idea that the most creative actual occasions occurring in living things, which Whitehead calls living occasions, are physico-chemically permissible but highly improbable tunings in the behavior of electrons across a macroscopic region of the living body. Indeed, within the framework of this hypothesis, it makes sense to imagine living occasions taking place in a space unoccupied by the less creative processes. Seen in this way, empty space means a space in which events are not dictated by the statistical laws of physics, including quantum theory and the theory of self-organized dynamical systems. The emptiness of this space consists in the absence of physics in a particular sense, that from a physical point of view, highly improbable but not impossible processes are taking place there. The empty space is the place where the living, although it does not abolish physics, makes physics serve its own essence. In the empty space, novelty is introduced that actualizes biological values. So there is a connection between this point, the importance of empty space, and the other biophilosophical intuitions Whitehead's about the novelty, the permanent introduction of novelty. I think permanent introduction of novelty occurs in what Whitehead calls interstices, or empty space in the cells or in the brain. The fourth and last biophilosophical intuitions I want to deal with today is about Darwinism. At various points in his work, Whitehead presents arguments for overcoming Darwinism with a value-centered theory of evolution. Although Whitehead considers Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to be the main scientific event of the 19th century, he firmly criticizes his successors since they attach much greater importance to the idea of natural selection than Darwin himself did. Whitehead sees natural selection as only one of the two important factors in evolution. The other is the massive modification of the environment by societies of living beings. Whitehead interprets evolution as, I quote, development of enduring harmonies of enduring shapes of value, end of quote. This follows from his biophilosophical intuition that every organism is a unit of emerging harmonies, that every organism is a unit of emerging value that arises for its own sake. The evolution of organisms is thus based, I quote, on a selective activity, end of quote, which is of teleological nature, since it emanates from the organism itself. Whitehead sees in evolution a steady development in the ability of living beings to change their environment through active intervention. which stems from their striving not simply to survive, but, I quote, to live well, to live better, end of quote. However, since the good life attained by a species is not stable, each species must eventually shake off its evolutionary acquired way of life and embark on the adventure of striving for a better life. In summary, evolution results from changing ways of life aimed at fulfilling the value of realizing a better life. Whitehead's process metaphysics, not only his biophilosophy, but his whole process metaphysics, rests on several premises, some of which have been introduced above, points 1 to 4. A further premise follows, which can be described as meta-philosophical, since it deals with the relationships of philosophy to the sciences and serves as an important methodological basis for Whitehead's work. It is not only a meta-philosophical intuition, but also has the potential to become a central dimension of a yet-to-be-created Whiteheadian theory of philosophical intuition. So now I'm going to present the sixth and last philosophical intuition Whitehead's: fallibility, schemes of thought, revisable metaphysics. Whitehead is convinced of the fundamental uncertainty and provisional nature of philosophical statements. His metaphysics sees an asymptotic approximation to a scheme of principle that express only tentatively the nature of the universe. Whitehead can be seen as a representative of fallibilism. He would never regard philosophical and other intuitions as infallible and therefore absolutely certain starting points for philosophical and scientific inquiry. But an improved, albeit preliminary, understanding of reality is attainable within the framework of a scheme of thought. So what is a scheme of thought? It is a system of ideas whose relevance to each other contributes to their mutual clarification. Since they support each other, the affirmation of some of these ideas contributes to the affirmation of the others. Typical schemes of thought are Newtonian dynamics, Malthus' economic theory, and Greek mathematics. So the idea of the scheme of thought is introduced in the third chapter of Function of Reason. And in my opinion, Whitehead viewed his own metaphysics as a scheme of thought. Although schemes of thought are hypothetical and often based on philosophical intuitions, their further development is shaped by agreement with empirical facts. This can lead to their alteration or partial modification. For Whitehead, then, the question of the primacy of theory or experience does not arise. I quote, "There is the progress from thought to practice and to regress from practice to thought. This interplay of thought and practice is the supreme authority, the supreme authority." So Whitehead is to the same degree a rationalist and empirist. Whitehead assumes a spiral development in which schemes of thought and facts are mutually dependent. Whitehead's metaphysics is therefore not an a priori based on reason, because as a superordinate scheme of thought, it is necessarily subject to feedback from all areas of knowledge, which means that its modification is unavoidable. Whitehead's philosophy is thus, I quote my teacher in Berlin, a revisable metaphysics, end of quote, a revisable metaphysics. It is an experimental adventure that will never end. Consequently, it rests on different methodological and truth theoretic notions than the great metaphysical systems of the past. Now, the third and last section, conclusion. Whitehead's understanding of intuition differs from the conception of intuition in the philosophical tradition of the West, of the Occident, in one respect in one respect in particular. Although the idea of intuition mediated through the senses and through introspection plays an important role in the works of Whitehead, his philosophy is distinguished for introducing a form of intuition that can be emphasized as philosophical intuition. The same applies to Bergson's philosophy. So philosophical intuition is a mental ability that only conceptually and symbolically thinking and intelligent beings can possess. Accordingly, the idea of philosophical intuition shows essential differences to the traditional conception of intuition. First difference: there is no opposition between philosophical intuition and discursive analysis, but only a creative tension that stimulates ever new synthesis of both. Conceptual analysis is thus inherent in every philosophical intuition. Second, because of the organic role that abstract conceptual thinking plays in any philosophical intuition, the latter cannot be infallible. On the contrary, as already said, philosophical intuition develops and enriches itself through errors. The third and last difference: in contrast to sensually mediated intuitions, philosophical intuition arises neither suddenly and instantaneously nor immediately. It does not automatically and effortlessly grasp its object with pure evidence. Philosophical intuition is a slowly evolving process that sometimes takes years of strenuous mental work to mature. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Spyridon. There's so much in what you have shared with us that I would love to discuss, but there are two themes I wanted to draw out and amplify and give you a chance to unpack a little bit here. The first is just on this last point. Whitehead's development of a philosophical intuition that is not opposed to discursive reason, I think comes through very clearly in his reaction to the failure of the Principia Mathematica to really eliminate any form of intuition in logic and mathematical logic in particular. It became clear to Whitehead that numerosity as such, our capacity to distinguish between numbers and to intuit just the difference between 1 and 2, that there is something there which requires this immediate grasp of unity, an immediate grasp of wholeness, and that no amount of logical gymnastics could eliminate that. So in some sense, logic depends on intuition, and intuition depends on logic to clarify its implications. And Whitehead's development of a fallible method of speculative philosophy and metaphysics, I think, is one of the great gifts of his philosophy of organism. And I'm glad that you highlighted it in this way and put it in its historical context to show how long the Western tradition in philosophy has been struggling with this issue. And I think Whitehead does provide us with at least a temporary resolution, holding that tension, but allowing us to continue to develop. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that before I ask one more question?
Yes, maybe. While I was listening at you, I was thinking at Brouwer's intuitionism. It was created, I think, in the 20s, 30s, and but we don't need to go that far. Even I mean, if we consider the beginning of formal logic in the ancient Greek philosophy with Aristotle, the deductive conclusion. I mean, something like all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, so Socrates is mortal. This can only be seen intuitively. If you can't see that intuitively, it's not possible to to prove that. Or if A is bigger than C and C is bigger than D, then A is bigger than D. You can't prove that. You have immediately to see that immediately. And this is actually, I think, for many centuries, we don't see that those basic operations are actually intuitive operations.
Mm-hmm.
They are not philosophical intuitions because they arise immediately. Either you can see that or not. If not, nobody can help you. But philosophical intuitions are based on those forms of intuitions, and of course also on other forms of intuitions, but not only on intuitions.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that fallibility is extremely important in Whitehead's philosophy, and that this is, in my opinion, the main difference between this style of metaphysics and the older style of metaphysics that claimed often explicitly to have reached final truths. And we know that this didn't happen only in philosophy, but also in science. Think, for example, of mechanistic physics at the late 19th century. They really thought that they had reached the end of physics at that time. And then they collapsed.
Right. Yeah, I think here of Whitehead's comments, I believe in Modes of Thought, he emphasizes that philosophy is not deduction. Philosophy is the search for premises, right? And logical deduction can help us make sure, help us avoid mistakes, but that's kind of a trivial procedure. That philosophy is seeking sheer disclosure, he would say. And this is why so often his use of metaphor and analogy is awaiting imaginative leaps from his readers in order to intuit the insight.
Yes.
Right. So one last issue I wanted to discuss with you has to do with Whitehead's response to Immanuel Kant. In his first lecture at Harvard in September of 1924, Whitehead makes a few really crucial comments that I want to share with everyone. This first lecture it's published in an issue of Process Studies, as well as in this book, Whitehead at Harvard, that is edited by Brian Henning and Joseph Pettick from the Whitehead Research Project, who, by the way, are doing wonderful work. And so Whitehead writes towards the beginning of this first lecture of his about Kant, and he says, while nobody, as far as he is aware, takes seriously Kant's exact theory of things in themselves, but while no one takes that exact rendition seriously, he says that anyone who lays emphasis on the problem which he set himself to solve, which is what are the conditions of scientific knowledge, is one way of framing Kant's problem in the Critique of Pure Reason. Anyone who sets himself this problem cannot doubt but that Kant's work forms a turning point in the progress of metaphysics. And he continues, the process of cognition is merely one type of relationship between things which occurs in the general becoming of reality. The becoming of relationships between things requires that the things which become related should be such as to be capable of these relations. Accordingly, the fact of any particular entity forming an element in a united universe, which is in the process of becoming, imposes upon that universe the obligation of being patient of it. Thus, every particular entity, by reason of what we may call its relational essence, imposes upon the rest of things a certain systematic character, whereby they tolerate its possibility of reality. Now he continues, Kant worked out this theory for the particular case of an entity capable of the relation of cognizance in the capacity of cognizant. In other words, Kant worked out relationality as relevant to organisms capable of knowledge, such as rational human beings, right? Kant was focused on cognition in particular as a mode of relationship. Whitehead continues, Kant asked, how is cognizance possible? How is knowledge possible? Whitehead says, I suggest to you the more general question. How is any particular entity possible, having regard to the relationships which it presupposes? And he thinks that it is this question that metaphysics will be able to advance beyond the problematic that Kant created. Now, Whitehead's generalizing Kant's problem beyond just how objects in nature relate to the knowing subject, so that it would be capable of addressing how any entity relates to any other entity, right? And this comes through in his theory of the actual occasion, which overcomes this dualism in Kant between deterministic causality on the one hand, which Kant said applies to everything in nature except the organism, and then the free decisions that rational agents are capable of exercising, right? So in Kant, you have this dualism between deterministic causation and free decision. And Whitehead's account of actual occasions of experience with their physical and mental pole overcomes this division, I would say. And I wonder, Spyridon, what if you think that this division has been overcome in Whitehead's philosophy of organism, and if so, what more you might say about this, about Whitehead's response to Kant and carrying forward of some of Kant's intuitions about organism that unfortunately Kant didn't get to fully develop, I would say.
Oh, a big question. So in my presentation, I put emphasis on the problem of causality. Yes, and starting from Hume, not from Kant, but as you know, Kant took this problem over from, or inherited this problem from Hume. I think that Whitehead says that we already know what is causality actually, and we experience that, within our own body. We do not experience that in the relations that we have to other things, to external things. But first of all, we experience that in the perception of our own body, that we know that there is a connection between past and present, that there is a relation in time, okay, that they are internally related, those different moments in time. And this seems to be a starting point for his understanding of causality as something that is not conveyed by discursive analysis, but something that is conveyed by an immediate form of experience. So, and this is something that neither Hume nor Kant have. So, but your question was more general, and maybe you could a little summarize it. What exactly is you were asking me?
It's a very big question. And I think rather than try to summarize it here, I will hold it for the discussion at the end of our session, and we can return to this. Is that all right? Because I think we could easily take the rest of our time to unpack it.
Yeah.
So let's hold off on that, and we'll return to this question of causality versus the capacity to make free decisions. We'll come back to that.
Yes.
At this point, I want to give our second author, Federico Giorgi, a chance to present on his chapter. Federico is a doctoral student at the University of Namur in Belgium, and his doctoral research concerns the relevance of Whitehead's theory of symbolism to the present-day philosophy of perception. And Giorgi's interests include process philosophy, as well as the philosophy of film and artificial intelligence. That last topic is coming up everywhere I turn today. But Federico will be summarizing his chapter in this book titled Whitehead's Pan-Experientialist Account of the Organismal Self-Creation. So Federico, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew, for the introduction, and I want to thank Professor Kodrofinis for editing the book. I want to thank the Jacob Institute, Mr. Livingston, and Matthew Sikal for organizing this seminar. And I have not prepared the slides for my presentation. I hope that it will be clear. But of course, if there are some points which are to be furtherly discussed, we can do that after my talk, or you can also interrupt me in whatever moment if there is something which is not clear. And so the topic on my chapter is organismal self-creation. That is the capability of organisms to self-determine their own way of functioning, regardless of the evolutionary history of their ancestor, because usually Maturana and Varela's theory of autopoiesis is regarded as one of the first accounts of organismal self-creation. But I think that Whitehead somehow foreknows this idea of self-creation. And also, I want to highlight that these two models of self-creation differ as to some very important aspect. I will assume as point of reference, on the one hand, the first version of the theory of autopoiesis, so mechanism and biological explanation, the theory of knowledge, and autopoiesis and cognition. As concerns Whitehead, I will talk mainly about process and reality. And so now I will introduce some ideas which I think are important in Maturana and Varela's account of self-creation. These ideas are important to my analysis, are relevant to my analysis. In the first place, I think that Maturana and Varela define a living being as a physical autopoietic machine. This phrase denotes an autopoietic machine which converts matter into itself, so that the result of this production is the organization of the machine. And an autopoietic machine, a physical autopoietic machine, can also be defined as a network of processes of production of components, and these components realize and regenerate the network, so that there is an endlessly turnover of components, which takes place under condition of perturbations and compensation of these perturbations. It is also important to note that Maturana and Varela define, also speak about teleology and about the relationship between mental phenomena and ontological reality. And these 2 points are very important in respect to my comparison with Whitehead. In the first place, Maturana and Varela think that teleology and function, which are which are sometimes regarded as important notions to describe biological phenomena, they think that these notions are unnecessary to describe what a living being is and what a living being does. because they think that when a teleological explanation comes into play, this happens when an external observer refers the output of the autopoietic, the physical autopoietic machine to himself. So the external observer links the output of the machine with himself. But this explanation only belongs to the observational domain, and it does not describe any actual characteristic of the functioning of the physical autopoietic machine. So if we analyze the structure of the physical autopoietic machine, we can explain the output of the machine in terms of the structure. And so this explanation highlights that actually teleology is unnecessary in biology. And the same goes for the notion of function, because Maturana and Varela argue that when we when we talk about function in relation to living beings, we always make reference to a broader conceptual scheme. But actually, if the notion of function is indispensable to describe biological phenomena, this only means that we lack inadequate knowledge of the overall system wherein the subsystem we are considering is included. The second important aspect I want to highlight in reference to the theory of autopoiesis, to the first version of the theory of autopoiesis, concerns the relationship between mental phenomena and the nervous system. Maturana and Varela describe the nervous system as a network of interactive neurons. They think that this network is coupled to the organism, and that this network contributes to the production, to the generation of the relations which define the autopoietic machine. But a mental phenomenon, such as, for example, memory or learning, stems from a change in the possible states of the nervous system. And this change can happen during the ontogeny of the organism because of the interactions of the organism with the environment. This means that a mental phenomenon, such as a learning, for example, is only the result of the coupling between the phenomenology of the nervous system and the phenomenology of the ambient. So descriptions in terms of acquirement of pieces of information, in terms of depictions, acquirement of depictions, all these descriptions are not relevant to the actual functioning of the nervous system. To sum up, the two Chilean biologists have a very reductionist approach to both teleology and to both mental phenomena. So now I will explain why there is a very important difference with Whitehead. In the first place, as is known, Whitehead describes an actual occasion as a stream of experience in terms of togetherness of experience. And so Whitehead rejects an interpretation of togetherness which is not based on the idea of a togetherness of experience. So he rejects somehow Kant's transcendental criticism. And also it is important, I think, in order to highlight the difference between the two models of self-creation I am considering, it is very important to distinguish between two lines of thought in the history of philosophy. Of course, this distinction presupposes that we assume experience and or perception as a point of reference. And so we, on the one hand, we have a line of thought which we can describe in terms of presentationalism. This first line of thought is mainly derived, is mainly inspired by the ideas of Plato and Leibniz, and this first line of thought rejects any metaphysical dualism between mentality and physical reality, and I have called this first line of thought presentationalism because it argues that reason illuminates things and makes things intelligible. The second line of thought I want to outline is inspired mainly by the ideas of Locke and Descartes. As is known, Locke conceives mind as a locked box stuffed with ideas, impressions, representations. This second line of thought is the dualism, of course, because it formulates a separation between the inward mental realm and the outward realm of physical reality. So, according to this second line of thought, all that we can have is just a correspondence between these two detached realms. So, having said that, I can show why there is an important difference between the theory of autopoiesis, the first version of the theory of autopoiesis, and Whitehead. I think that we can associate Maturana and Varela to the second line of thought. The dualistic approach paves the way for materialistic neurosciences, and I think that we can define the theory of autopoiesis as a materialistic approach. As I have said, Maturana and Varela describe the nervous system as a material network of interacting neurons, and they reduce mental phenomena to what happens in this network. Whereas I think that Whitehead parallels the first line of thought, the line of thought which I have described in terms of presentationalism, because presentationalism argues that when perception takes place, when experience takes place, there is always a cooperation between two factors. On the one hand, we have a not ready-made reality. On the other hand, we have a subject who actualizes this reality. We can also say cooperative realism to describe the presentationalist approach to experience and to perception. I think that the same happens in Whitehead's cosmology if we take into consideration Whitehead's notion of prehension. Of course, we have three factors which come into play: the subject, the subjective form, and the datum. And the datum is objectified in the constitution of the prehending subject. Also, it is important to remark that Whitehead ascribes to the concrescence a subjective character. He does not separate the essence of the subject from its experiences. And as is known, Whitehead divides the concrescence into three phases. We have the responsive phase, the sheer reception of the datum, which comes from the pre-existing environment. We have the supplemental phase, the phase of the enjoyment, wherein what was felt as extraneous is now felt as private. And we have the satisfaction, which is the climax of the concrescence, which is the phase wherein all indeterminateness is overcome. Accordingly, I think that this is very useful to highlight how important is the notion of experience in Whitehead's account of Whitehead's ontology. So the first difference concerns the ontological status of mental phenomena. The second important difference between the two models of self-creation is about teleology, because Whitehead describes concrescence as a teleological self-creative process wherein the subject does not pre-exist the concrescence. He rather emerges from the concrescence. So the subject is not only subject, it is also a subject superject. It is the final end of the concrescence. And also Whitehead introduces some notions which immediately evoke the idea of a telos, so subjective aim, and also subjective unity, I think. The subject conditions the feelings which take place in the incomplete phases of the concrescence. And but I think that it is noteworthy that the concept of telos in Whitehead's account of concrescence is not to be understood only as an aim, but in terms of a final state directedness. So this was the second difference I wanted to highlight. And now I will describe Whitehead's account of life in process and reality, my interpretation of Whitehead's account of life. In the first place, we have to specify that when Whitehead, when we speak of an organism, we are speaking of a living structured society in Whitehead parlance. A structured society is a society which includes both subordinate societies and subordinate nexus, and which provides them with a favorable environment. And we have two kinds of society which are distinguished by Whitehead, the non-living structured society and the living structured society. They differ as to the way of facing environmental novelties, as to the strategy they adopt to survive. A non-living structured society eliminates details, so it is able to feel an environmental nexus merely as one nexus rather than as a multiplicity of actual occasions. So the details are neglected. Quite the opposite, a living structured society receives, accepts novel elements coming from the environment by an initiative in conceptual apprehensions. So it is able to receive these novel elements into feelings which are compatible with the experiences of the members of the society. It is noteworthy that a society is actually living only in a derivative sense, because a living structured society is merely a structured society wherein living occasions prevail. So in process and reality, life is ascribed to actual occasions, to living occasions. The situation is different in adventures of ideas, but in process and reality, the fundamental concept for Whitehead's theory of life is the living occasion. A living occasion is an actual occasion whose subjective aim or mental pole has produced a novelty of definiteness which cannot be found among the data available for the responsive phase of the actual occasion at issue. And a very important difference has to be introduced between social order, between a society and an actual occasion, as to the way of reacting to environmental stimuli, because as is known, a society is characterized by the hereditary transmission of a defining characteristic. So its reactions to environmental stimuli are describable in terms of efficient cause. Differently, the reactions of an actual occasion are describable in terms of final cause. And the reaction of an actual occasion are dictated by the present, not by the past. This is important, I think, because this difference, which is introduced by Whitehead, as concerns the way of reacting to environmental stimuli, stresses very well that in process reality, life cannot be a defining characteristic, and so, properly speaking, life cannot pertain to societies. Life cannot, and this is the reason why when living occasions unite in a nexus, they give rise to an entirely living nexus, and an entirely living nexus is one of the few examples of a nexus which is not a society. I think that this definition of an entirely living nexus illuminates very well a possible interpretation of Whitehead's account of life. I think that Whitehead, in the first place, we have to remark that Whitehead considers nexus nexus made up by actual occasions in the empty space as a non-social nexus. This is a clear statement that Whitehead does, that Whitehead makes. Accordingly, if life pertains to nexus and not to societies, this is the reason why Whitehead places life in the interstices of the living cell, in the interstices of the brain, just like, of course, Professor Kotrofinis remarked in his previous presentation. And the notion of interstices, I think that is very useful to understand what Whitehead, how Whitehead interprets life. The Bez distinguishes between two possible meanings of the word interstice. On the one hand, interstice can be interpreted in a spatial sense, but it can also denote an interstice can also be a temporal interstice. If we take into consideration the first meaning of the word interstice, so the spatial meaning of the word interstice, this word denotes only the in-between zones which interpose apparently full bodily parts, for example, fissures, for example, empty spaces. And this first meaning of the word stresses that life presupposes the apparently full bodily parts, and that it has no reality apart, has not positive reality apart from the effects it can have on the full bodily parts. Of course, I think that possible interpretations of Whitehead's account of life can be proposed. I think that, of course, the notion of interstice is very useful, but I am aware that this is not the only possible interpretation of the topic. The second possible meaning of the word interstice is the temporal meaning. So an interstice can also be defined as a pause, as a temporal interval which separates two events. For example, a silence which separates two notes, two consecutive notes belonging to the same song. An interstice can also be a silence which breaks a series of thunderclaps. In this latter example, which is taken from William James, we can hear and we can distinguish a thunderclap thanks to the silence, thanks to the interstice. But if we take into consideration the issue from the opposite perspective, we can also say that we can notice the silence, the interval, because of the thunderclap. So what is the event? What is full? And what is the interval, what is the silence, what is the interstice, is just a matter of perspective. If we take into consideration, and this is my final remark for my presentation, if we take into consideration the idea of a series of events which is regularly interposed by intervals, this idea immediately evokes the idea of rhythm. And I think that in process reality, the concept of rhythm and the concept of life are closely interconnected. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Federico. I've also been thinking for many years about the intersections between Whitehead's philosophy of organism and Maturana and Varela's theory of autopoiesis. And you did a wonderful job highlighting the tensions between these two approaches and the overlaps. Those who were present a few weeks ago at the Cobb & Friends session, when Spyridon and I began to introduce some of these concepts, will remember that I referred to Varela's last chapter, last article with Andreas Weber called Life After Kant, where he recants some of these earlier views about teleology and tries to develop a biophenomenological, let's say, account of the center of concern that emerges in the context of the autopoietic network of an organism. And he uses Whitehead's notion of the subject pole to root a kind of immanent teleology in the biological world. And so Varela, it seems, perhaps with a little bit of help from Whitehead, did come around in the end to bring purpose back into a kind of purpose back into the living world, and to distance himself from the earlier view that considered autopoiesis to be a purely mechanical account. Do you want to say anything about that shift which occurred in Varela's thinking, at least?
Well, actually, I have been focused mainly on the first version of the theory of autopoiesis. So basically, I had still to approach the last phase of Varela's account of the topic. So for the moment, I don't have anything to add to that.
No problem. So one other quick question for you, and then we'll open it up to invite comments and questions from our participants today. So one criticism I have heard of the autopoietic approach comes from the philosopher of biology and philosopher of science and Whiteheadian thinker as well, Donna Haraway. She has suggested in one of her recent books, Staying with the Trouble, that she, as she puts it, quote, nothing is really autopoietic or self-organizing, self-producing. And instead, she suggests this term sympoiesis, which means making with. And she's really emphasizing the relational dimension here. And even though Whitehead describes his actual occasions as self-creating, they create themselves out of prior occasions of experience which they inherit, right? And so as he puts it, actual occasions are in one another. And so there is a kind of sympoiesis even in that self-creating process. And so I wonder if, first of all, do you agree with Donna Haraway's criticism of autopoiesis, an emphasis on sympoiesis? And do you think that Whitehead is more in line with this sort of relational creativity that she is pointing towards?
Thank you for this very interesting question. When you speak, when you talk about creating with, Well, I think that this phrase really highlights an important aspect of Whitehead's cosmology, and I immediately think about his definition of creativity. The universe gives rise to a new entity. There is a new entity which comes out of the universe, and the universe is the number of members of the universe is increased by one. As concerns Maturana and Varela, I think that if I have to give to you an immediate answer, I agree with this criticism. So again, thank you for mentioning it, because if they stick to a dualistic view of a dualistic approach, so a dualistic, maybe a dualistic philosophy and a dualistic view of life, of course, it is impossible to adequately consider relations, I think. And I think that this is what Whitehead points out also in Science and the Modern World. For example, when he speaks of abstraction, I think that one of the most important examples of misplaced concreteness is dualism. You seem a little perplexed. Do you agree?
No, I agree. Yes, just lots to think about here.
So I really think that dualism is one of the most dangerous abstractions, and it is one of the most significant obstacles we have to understand what reality, what concrete reality is, and what concrete life is.
This question of dualism is part of what I was getting at in my question for Spyridon earlier. There's this inheritance from Kant, who was focused very much on the autonomous subject, the human rational subject, as in Kant's terms, he instituted this new Copernican revolution in philosophy that put the human subject at the center again, and described the phenomenal world of nature as in some way a construct of our subjectivity. And I think Maturana and Varela's original account of autopoiesis, when they talked about the nervous system's role, is very Kantian in that sense. That they want to describe the experience of any organism or of the human organism as in some ways operationally closed, so that there's no information coming from the environment into the organism. Rather, what the organism experiences is a function of the network of relations internal to itself. So you have a similar phenomenal noumenal divide as you saw in Kant's philosophy. And where Kant tries to go a little bit further in the critique of judgment, when he discusses self-organization for the first time, in the way that in the organism, even the simplest form of life, he says, a mere blade of grass is exhibiting a form of causality beyond what Newton's mechanical understanding of nature can account for, because the cause and effect enter into this circular relationship with one another. And so Kant wants to overcome this dualism between the decisions that rational human subjects are capable of making, the free decisions, and the determination, the necessary determinism exhibited in the physical world. And he wants to overcome this with the concept of organism. But I feel like Maturana and Varela didn't in their earlier work fully exploit this Kantian insight, whereas Whitehead does, and allows us to see how causation in the physical pole and decision, which occurs in the mental pole, are part and parcel of the same process of concrescence, right? And so Whitehead allows us to integrate these. Do you follow?
What you are saying is very interesting about Kant, about the theories of autopoiesis. I wonder, actually, I read Kant for the last time, maybe 8 years ago. And do you think that I have a question for you, because what you are saying is very interesting. Do you think that Kant succeeds in overcoming the dualism? Because I feel a little perplexed about that. If we formulate a conception of reality wherein there is a phenomenon and there is a noumenon, I think that it is very difficult to overcome this kind of dualism. But of course, as I've said, I have also read the classical texts of Whitehead, not all his texts. So what do you think about that? And then I will answer also to the second question concerning Maturana and Varela.
I don't think Kant does ultimately overcome the dualism, but in the Critique of Judgment, he refers to this supersensible substratum that may unite the freedom of human subjects with the apparent determinism of nature. And so he says there is we're at least justified in imagining the possibility of some integration of these two sides of a dualism, but he doesn't provide it for us. But he points the direction that one may go, and I think some post-Kantian idealist philosophers like Schelling really did carry that hint forward, but Kant himself did not achieve it, I don't think, no.
Okay. In my opinion, if we are to try to overcome dualism, the only solution I have in my mind up to now is that one has to put experience at the center of his cosmology, at the center of his own philosophy. I have in my mind, for example, Time and Free Will, Bergson's Time and Free Will, because Bergson elaborates his own idea of duration by taking into consideration the physical state, the psychological states of human being. And I think that Bergson's way of proceeding is a little more simple in comparison, for example, to Kant or to Whitehead, but it shows that we have to shift our perspective, because otherwise physical reality and the conceptual tools which we get from physics always tend to prevail over what is conveyed to us by our experience. Of course, Whitehead does, I think, pretty much the same operation in a certain sense, because he compares philosophy to the airplane, to the aircraft. And so he says we have to start with our immediate experience, and then we have to generalize and to broaden the meaning of the semiotic application of our terminology, so as to get a cosmology wherein we can ascribe experience, finalism, and some mental properties to actual occasions. So my point is we have to change our perspective. I think this is the only way to overcome dualism, the only way I know to overcome dualism. And as concerns Maturana and Varela, I feel a little disappointed by their phenomenological approach, because I think that this is my impression. They have kind of intuition that the living beings, the single living beings, is very important, and this intuition can theoretically pave the way for a very adequate approach to life and to reality, but they do not have philosophical tools to explain and to develop this intuition. And when they continuously escape from defining what is teleology, what is a mental phenomenon, I think that they renounce to stick to what our immediate experience conveys to us. They are not able maybe to create a cosmology and ontology just like Whitehead does.
Yes, well said. I agree. So, as you can see, the cup floweth over. We have so much to talk about with this rich text. We will continue next Saturday, the 21st. We will have 3 presenters, Philip Tryon, Johanna Heusler, and Nathaniel Barrett. So please do join us next weekend, and we will continue to explore life from a process perspective. Thank you to our speakers today, and thanks for the wonderful questions. Hope to see you all in a week.